Welcome to this CRRF Seminar series for today's webinar on what is rural policy today. First of all, my name is Patrick Bruder. I'm the president of the Canadian Rural Revitalisation Foundation, and I'm one of the British Columbia Regional Innovation Chairs, and I work at Vancouver Island University on Coast Salish territory. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, today I am coming to you from Coast Salish territory on the Pacific coast of Canada, and specifically today I'm on the traditional territories of the Coquitlam and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I think we are all coming today from the traditional territories of the First Peoples all across Canada and perhaps even around the world. So welcome to everyone. A little bit about CRRF. The Canadian Rural Revitalisation Foundation was established in 1989 to contribute to the revitalisation and sustainability of rural Canada. We are an organisation comprised of members from across Canada with strong international links representing rural leaders, rural organisations, development practitioners, government policymakers, researchers, students and other rural stakeholders interested in the future of rural Canada. And today we are really delighted to reinvigorate and restart our CRRF seminar series with this webinar on what is rural policy today. I'm going to hand it over now to Tamara Kravchenko, the lead author of the report, and just to begin by saying thank you so much, Tamara, for making this report and working with us to have a CRRF report that is so strong and so needed, and it's a really great report, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you and your team today. So welcome.
Great, thanks so much. Brooke, could you switch the slide to the next? Thanks. So thank you so much for everyone to join us today. I'm really thrilled to be releasing this work, and huge thanks to our funder, CRRF. This was an insight development grant that allowed us to do this, and also to CRRF for having us and having this as a report. So my name is Tamara Kravchenko. I'm an assistant professor at University of Victoria in the School of Public Administration. I'm on Lekwungen speaking territory, and we have this wonderful team that contributed to this project. And just want to say one word about why we did this is that, well, from my perspective, I moved back to Canada a couple of years ago, and I really wanted to have this broad overview. So the purpose of this is really breadth over depth. We wanted a snapshot of what's happening, and we look forward to presenting some of our high-level results, and the full report can be found on the website. So I'm going to pass it over to quick introductions from the rest of the team, and then Brooke is going to lead some of the key findings. Then we are going to have a kind of discussion with Dr. Bill Reimer and Dr. Sarah Breen on how this resonates or not with any of their own research, because they are gurus. And then we'll open the floor to discussions and question and answer with all of you. So Karen, did you want to start introducing yourself?
Sure. So I'm Karen Foster. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie, which is located in Mi'kmaq on the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I also hold the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada. So I think the relevance of this report to my work is probably pretty obvious. It would be really helpful. It has been really helpful to have a kind of bird's eye view of provincial policy and where rural currently fits, with a little bit of information on where it has fit in the past and how things have changed over time. Over to Sean.
Great, thanks very much, Karen and Tamara. Appreciation also to CRRF for hosting this event today and publishing the report. My name is Sean Markey. I'm a professor with the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. I'm coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Stolo First Nation. And CRRF is such a wonderful network, knowledge network right across the country. I think that network has provided with an opportunity to understand rural policy in different dimensions and different areas of the country. But what we've really lacked, I think, is a comprehensive cross-Canada comparative piece that we can all look to better understand what's happening in rural policy across the country. And this report, I think, has done a really wonderful job of filling that gap. It's a snapshot, as we'll see and hear from Brooke as we sort of roll out the methodology and the findings. But I think there are findings in the report that we can cross-reference with what is daring to say perhaps an emerging consensus about how to do rural policy well in this country. And I think the findings challenge all of us as researchers, as policy actors, as communities to sort of step up our game in the rural policy arena. And CRRF has been a wonderful institution for building those relationships. And I think allowing us an opportunity to share findings widely and to engage directly with policy actors to hopefully make a real difference. So thanks very much.
Leaves me for introduction. So I'm Brooke Hayes. I am a PhD student at the University of Victoria in the School of Environmental Studies, and I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. I feel very, very lucky to have landed in an opportunity to work with this really interesting team and on this interesting subject. My PhD research is into the relationship between soil quality and farmers' mental health from a British Columbia and Pan-Canadian perspective. So this is related, but also really unique with my background spending 20 years with the BC provincial sector in 6 different ministries. So I really am grateful to have an opportunity to put some of that into practice by getting a chance to look across the country and see what everyone else is doing. So happy to be a part of this work and a part of the presentation. Really happy to see everyone that's joined today. So that leads us into our first slide. And I believe, Tamara, you were going to speak to the context piece, which there we go, the state of current rural policy, just the high level introduction.
Yeah, so the general findings are here that we find in that there are a lot of piecemeal approaches, that it's fragmented, and that there is a disconnect. And an important context here is that we have a new Minister of Rural Economic Development that is coordinating nationally, and this is really important, and it's a real opportunity for Pan-Canadian vision and for greater involvement of the federal government. We're seeing federally that there are important investments in infrastructure for rural communities, and that's a key focus of national policies and funding at the moment, and that there is an increasing recognition of the need to understand regional strengths and opportunities rather than just sectors. So the federal context is changing, and we're seeing a political commitment, but we really want to understand what that will look like in the future. And we did not we have a section on federal policies, but we really focused more on provincial and territorial policies in this report.
Thank you. So that leads us into a review of the actual report, of which you'll see quite a lot of information on the website. Obviously, this is just a very quick introduction, and there's a lot more information online. I wanted to begin with the overarching question for this project, which was, what are the characteristics of rural policy today, and how do the practices that we're seeing differ across Canada? And this next few minutes, I'll just take to walk through the methods that we use to look at answering this question, and also some of the key findings with a couple of case studies to illustrate the findings. This slide is just a high-level view of the methodology. You can see that we were looking at all provinces and territories through this research, which involved a significant amount of desktop research looking at websites of government ministries and departments, looked at every single ministry and department website that I could find on each of these regional locations, looked at the structure of the organization where rural resided as a priority within each of these jurisdictions, and then reviewed any plans, programs, or strategies that I could find related to sector and social priorities. This was followed by interviews and verification. So the summaries for each region were sent to the regions for verification, often followed with interviews or email correspondence to confirm that we had things right, more or less. And then from that, we're able to conduct a comparative analysis, a thematic assessment, and then bring to you some of these key findings today. I wanted to quickly note that the dates of the policy review are shown at the bottom of the slide. This work was conducted from January to July of last year. So what you're seeing may have changed slightly, but this is still relatively recent research. So diving straight into the findings, this is just the summary findings to give you a sense of the breadth and scope of the assessment that was done. You'll see that we reviewed through this process 331 individual strategies, plans, and programs across all of the different jurisdictions. And at the high level, you can see that the vast majority of interventions, so approximately 73% of the interventions that we reviewed, were directed to the sector level. So a smaller proportion were directed to broad rural areas, and an even smaller portion were directed to specific communities with economies in transition. We had a good mix of plans, programs, and strategies across those different regions. You can see relatively even split across those three different tools, those different types of interventions. And then the main finding here in terms of how rural are these interventions is that about 26% of those approaches were identified as having a high rural content. I'll get to what that means in just a moment, with the majority, 3/4 of the interventions being either medium or low relevance to rural areas. The breakdown of what types of strategies, plans, and programs we looked at is the bottom here. So the majority, again, were in the economic development and natural resources area. And within that, there's significant detail in the report that explains how many of those different types of interventions were, high rural content, low rural content, etc. So when we're talking about assessing rural content, I just wanted to give a very quick view into what we meant by high rural content, medium, and low. When we're talking about interventions that had high rural content, this is really meaning that rural is the main focus of the document, or it appears as really a critical fundamental component of the document in more than one place. A medium rural content assessment would be that the document, the plan, program, or strategy talks about rural, but is primarily sector specific and may have one or two actions that are really looking to address the needs of a rural community. And a low rural content would mean that either the needs of or the importance of rural communities with respect to that sector or that context of that document is not there or is very silent. So this is just a quick view into how we were assessing these different things. And again, there's more detail on the methodology in the report. This methodology led to 6 key findings, which I'll spend just a minute here describing, and then we'll move into a couple of case studies that really illustrate these. The first key finding is that really the territories stood head and shoulders above as regional, rural, and remote economic development leaders. They exceeded expectations in all areas that we assessed. And while they only had 0.3% of the population of Canada, they were responsible for 22% of all interventions reviewed. So there's a significant amount of activity happening in the territories. And interestingly, their tools are integrated by design. So we see clear line of sight from their programs, to their plans, to their strategies with rural needs incorporated throughout. So there's a real leadership in that territory. There's also the second finding here is, what I already sort of hinted at, that sector-specific approaches dominate the narrative. So as I mentioned, 73% of those interventions are focused on the sector, and only 4 strategies identified across the country were designed with a broad rural focus. What I mean by that is a rural economic development strategy, for example. And the 4 places where we found those were the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Quebec, and British Columbia. So those are areas that have those present, at least documented on their websites. The third key finding is that, natural resource activity, energy, forestry, mining, etc., agriculture, are happening primarily in rural places. But what we found is that the opportunities for rural economic development were largely missed. For example, we think about agriculture as happening primarily in rural areas, but only 7 of the 33 programs, plans, and strategies we looked at, only 7 of 33 had high rural content. So the vast majority of those as well, only 1 of those was a strategy. Even within those that are targeted to agriculture in rural areas, the majority are at the program level. So we don't really see the strategic approach for rural in those natural resource sectors. The fourth finding is that tourism as a diversification strategy we hear a lot about as an opportunity for rural areas, but the opportunity for rural tourism was truly missing in almost every region. The only region that was the exception was Nunavut in this case. And the focus was on the sector level. So that's another key finding. The fifth is that structure matters. So as I mentioned, we did look to where does rural sit within each of the territories' governance structures. And what we found is that regions that have a higher rural or remote population are consistently coordinating their rural priorities. So areas that have a more urban center are less likely to coordinate. They're going to be more sector oriented. The places where there are, another way of saying this is that places with arm's length approaches are less integrated. So Alberta, Manitoba, and New Brunswick all have delegated their rural leadership to arm's length entities, broader public sector entities, and they tended to have less integrated and less rurally focused activities. And the final finding is that innovation as a strategy for economic growth is really missing in the rural spaces. So only 3 jurisdictions offered any rural lens within their innovation approaches, and many regions do not have an innovation strategy. So again, Quebec, BC, and Alberta were the 3 that did mention rural within their innovation approaches. So those are some of the key findings. We'll have a chance to discuss those in a moment, lots of detail in the report. I wanted to offer 2 quick case studies to show how these appeared in practice. The first is in Ontario, and I don't mean to pick on Ontario. There are over a dozen examples of this in practice across the country. So bear with me while I pick on Ontario for a moment. The reason for this is that it's a forest sector strategy that is sector-based, that's happening in a jurisdiction that, the activity is primarily in rural areas. They've seen this major sector decline since 2000 in terms of timber volume. And this strategic document for the forest sector sustainable growth does not have a mention of the impact of this transition on rural communities or the opportunity to involve rural communities in the economic development and sustainable growth of this sector. So you can see the focus is on a very high level statement around, more provincial objectives. Additionally, there is in Ontario this forest sector investment and innovation program, $10 million over 5 years, which the word rural does not appear in. So it's focused on bringing investment to the sector rather than supporting those communities in transition. So this is really the sector dominated approach. This is a great example of that, but there are many, many examples of this in practice that occur across the entire country. Conversely, I wanted to share the Nunavut example. This was certainly a heads and shoulders above the rest of the country in terms of their integrated approach to rural priorities. So you can see here that the Rural Economic Development Strategy, Nunavut's vision, is the economic development strategy. So rural and remote is incorporated into the overarching economic development strategy for the territory. What's interesting about their vision is that it appears, integrated within other strategies in other sectors. So the transportation strategy speaks to social strategic objectives. So then it also supports tourism strategic objectives. The small craft harbors is part of the transportation strategy and the tourism sector and the arts and crafts sector. So they cross-reference each other in a really integrated way. And then this is really routine. So what's different about Nunavut is that obviously they're the most recent territory to form within the country from a governance perspective, as well as they don't have traditional political parties. So they're operating based on consensus, which might be one of the reasons that we see that difference. But integration is just the way things are done in the territories. So in summary, this is just one perspective, and certainly there are a lot more detail in the report. We have detailed profiles for each province and territory to take a look at, but just if you were going to take a very quick snapshot of the country, what I might say about how things are based on what we've seen is that our territories are truly our rural development leaders across the countries and have some really interesting stories to tell about how they are supporting the economic development of their remote areas. Rural is on the agenda in BC and particularly in Quebec, where they have a governance structure that's designed to support regional and rural communication and prioritization. And PEI, where they've done work over several years to build a rural program. Whereas there are other areas that are still looking to coordinate, that are more sector oriented, more trade and export focused. So that idea that rural areas are primarily agricultural still persists in some areas, And it's not necessarily on the agenda in some of our Atlantic areas. Although it may be emerging, and again, this was a snapshot in time, so things may be changing, and this is one perspective. So with that, I will turn it back to Karen and Samara to walk us through some of the potential implications of this, and then we can move into a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Brooke. So I'm going to lead off the implications and then hand it over to Tamara. So what our report has shown then is that rural policy in Canada can be characterized as diverse, but disconnected. And this is important because, as with any policy area, connection, integration, and coordination are really needed for efficacy. In any area of policy, rural policy included, individual policies affect one another, and so they impact one another's efficacy, their outcomes, and also their inputs. So they really do need to be coordinated, and that is time-consuming, labor-intensive, human work, but it needs to be done. And so we've highlighted what's happening in Nunavut, and you know, there's maybe hope that other provinces can learn from that approach. Our study stops short of actually assessing policy impact. So we only know what governments are writing about their policies on their websites. We don't really know how much they're actually accomplishing or doing, or what this looks like on the ground. So the lived experience of any given province might not reflect what we're finding on the web. But it is still important in that what's written in policy is all we really have to hold governments accountable, right? So what they're saying is a lot of the picture. So we can draw out some conclusions and implications. So first, we see that there's a lot going on in rural areas, and rural is relevant to a wide range of sectoral and social and economic policy. It's not front and center usually, but it is and should be considered everywhere, and certainly not just in agricultural policy. So this notion that rural communities are, you know, homogenous and that they're just where food gets grown, or it's definitely not the case. It's also vital to appreciate that economic development is going to happen and look differently in rural areas compared to urban. So merely referring to rural communities in the context of policy that is designed in and with urban areas in mind is not enough. There needs to be a deeper understanding of how growth or any kind of development occurs in rural communities. And I'm going to hand it over to Tamara now to talk about the philosophical shifts or paradigm shifts in rural development.
Yeah, I guess the purpose here is that within the report, we inherently identify what we describe as leading practices. And those leading practices have a number of characteristics, and they correspond with what a lot of the OECD research has been talking about, this rural policy 3.0, which has changed over the years, but is essentially saying that we've seen a shift from a focus on subsidies and entitlements in rural policy towards really investment and increasing competitiveness, and also a broader focus on well-being as well. And this corresponds with a focus on just sectoral dynamics, particularly agriculture, to really thinking about rural regions as they are integrated or not across regional dynamics. So to really have a very nuanced understanding of place and what that means for economic and social development and well-being. And finally, there's always this question about where rural policy should sit within any bureaucracy. It's a tough one. We see a lot of different approaches. But what is really critical are those underpinning governance mechanisms. So Brooke mentioned Quebec. We know that Quebec has had really great investments in community, rural community development, and those investments seem to be really showing off. So there's always the question of bureaucratically where this sits, how to deliver on integrated policy perspectives, but also what are the governance foundations that can deliver better rural outcomes? And so we see a lot of emerging opportunities to have more integrated sectoral priorities and to really reimagine governance and strengthen governance in the Canadian context. So thank you so much. That's just a snapshot of our research, and we are going to hand it over to Patrick to convene a conversation with Sarah and Bill, reflecting on the extent to which this bird's eye view reflects and connects to their own research. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Tamara and Brooke. That was great. Yeah, so I'd like to welcome our two discussants, and we're very lucky. If we're talking rural policy, we couldn't have found two better discussants in Bill Reimer and Sarah Breen. So Bill and Sarah, I'm going to put just a few questions to you, and you can feel free to elaborate as much as you want. I also think that Tamara and your team, if you want to jump back in, or if Bill and Sarah want to send any secondary questions your way, I think we'll have you on standby ready to jump in as needed. For everyone else in the audience, feel free to type any questions or comments you have in the chat. You'll see I've also posted the link to the full report there, which you can deep dive into after we finish today. So you can put questions in the chat, and when the discussions are done, if there is some time for one or two questions also directly via the microphone from the audience, that would be fine too. We'll see how we get on. But first, I'll put the first question. I think I'll start with Bill, as I can see him on my screen. So, and the same question will be coming to you too, Sarah. But does this report resonate with your own rural research?
Yes, definitely. But first, let me congratulate the authors. It's wonderful to see the sort of systematic and thorough and competent work that you've done here, especially in an age where we're so much faced with anecdotes and generalizations and so on in our social media. So I'm really thrilled to see how you've proceeded here, and congratulate you on your work. It's a lovely contribution. In terms of your question, Patrick, I was initially quite, in a sense, disappointed to see that it kind of confirmed what has been unfolding among the new rural economy project, which I directed for about 11 or 12 years. It kind of confirmed the way in which globalization, mechanization, and our reliance on commodities have led us to community decline and less of a focus on rural communities. That community leaders make little use of systematic research evidence. It was another thing that we ended up finding. Urbanization has shifted power and resources to urban regions, and intersectoral and interdepartmental issues are weakly supported. It also seems to be a kind of an unfolding of a situation where municipalities and communities are relatively weak, and they're placed in competition by Canadian government structures and policies. Then there are very few institutional structures and supports for regional collaboration among communities. The one bright spot during our NRE days was the emergence of the Quebec rural policy, which was a wonderful success story for 13 years, but then was shut down in 2014. I think the things that we're seeing now in terms of the Quebec policies are still a legacy of that rural policy, the approach that they took, and most importantly, the things that regional leaders learned. They learned how to work together across regions, and I think that they that legacy is one that has been unfolding, although in a much more subdued fashion. So that was my kind of first reading. I thought, oh my God, things haven't changed. They're still moving along in the same way. But on a closer reading and my innate optimism, which I was always looking for the good signs, it led me to consider some of the more promising features of the report. And these kind of emerge as I think about the questions, subsequent questions that might come out of this. That is, what makes for good rural policy, and how might we approach? Once again, I'm heavily influenced by our NRE work, our New Rural Economy work, and looking at some of the OECD material that has been so important, I think, in thinking about rural policies. I think good rural policy facilitates the building of these regional and community capacities. It reorganizes regions in collaborative forms. The territories in your report are great examples of this, the way in which the territories have been organized. Quebec's another example, because they did introduce the issue of territories and geography in some very innovative ways. And good rural and remote policy requires more institutional support for intersectoral activities. We know that anything that has to do with a focus on geography is innately intersectoral. And the same thing goes with respect to communities and rural and remote regions. So you can't get away from intersectoral considerations, and you need to build the capacity to address those. If I can anticipate your next question, Patrick.
Go ahead, Will.
Which is about where do we go from here? And my mind went to three different kinds of audiences that are likely to turn up in this event. The first are policymakers, people involved in doing policy and organizing governments and so on and so forth. And I think what the report suggests is that we need to strengthen the intersectoral and interdepartmental collaboration. Sectoral-based institutions have a long history to build their strength, to lobby for their interests, and to protect their personal and institutional interests. So if you're in a particular department, you've got a lot of resources, sectoral department, you've got a lot of resources to make sure you get a chunk of that budget. And anything that is intersectoral is relatively weak by comparison. So if there are cutbacks, it's first the intersectoral ones that get put to one side in the face of the sectoral lobby. So I think that's a pattern that has to be recognized by policymakers and government and so on, is that intersectoral, although incredibly important and becoming more so if we look at climate issues and we look at water or anything like this, intersectoral and interdepartmental initiatives and organizations are relatively weak, and they have to be strengthened. I think the policy approaches also have to extend to regional collaboration and support via institutional reorganization. Currently, many of our provincial governments see communities as separate, and actually sets up conditions where they're in competition. So they'll end up saying, oh, we've got a chunk of money here, you apply, we'll give you a chunk of money to help build your rural capacity. Aren't we great? But the problem is that those communities that are already strong are the ones that are first at the trough and able to manage that. The ones that are weak are left further behind. And so you get a bifurcation of capacity, not general strengthening. Quebec's rural policy was an imaginative and wonderful antidote to this. They set up regions and said, any community in your region that is weak you come up to us with a plan for how that will be strengthened, and we will provide additional funding and support. So they turned a weak community into an asset for the region. Very, very clever. Unfortunately, that went by the way when the new governments came in. I think encouraging and facilitating informal networks, bureaucracies have to learn how to work with volunteer informal groups, which is what often takes place in rural areas. And they have to do so in such a manner that they don't shut down their enthusiasm. We had a number of examples within the NRE project where local groups would set up a really interesting projects. The government would say, oh, well, we can get involved in this. They would load on all of the bureaucratic requirements. And the volunteers, these were volunteers, said, oh, I'm not interested in all that stuff. And their enthusiasm would drop. Bureaucracies need to come up with better ways in which to engage in a supportive fashion with these groups and innovative groups. Notice in the rural areas, a lot of these innovations are social in nature. They're not new necessarily, new engineering features and so on. So from the point of view of researchers, I think some of the questions I would encourage students to look at for theses and faculty to look at for projects are questions like, what are the conditions that stimulate the emergence and sustenance of regional networks? Or what conditions stimulate rural-urban collaboration? This is another theme that came out of the New Rural Economy Project, is that the power is going to urban areas, rural and remote regions. It's in their interest to form collaborations with those groups. They may not be around the word rural, but certainly urban people are concerned about water, they're concerned about food, they're concerned about energy, they're concerned about the climate, they're concerned about minerals. All of these are innately rural-based issues. And there's plenty of opportunities available, and we have some nice examples where that's been a feature of rural initiatives, is to establish networks with urban people and on urban issues. We actually have produced some materials, I'll pass them on in the chat room, that make some suggestions for rural communities that would like to look at ways in which they can increase their urban collaboration. I'll leave it there. Patrick, did you have other questions, or I might have?
What I'm going to do now, Bill, is I'm going to thank you very much for those in-depth comments and a great overview. I'm going to throw it over to Sarah and ask her the same question, but I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Bill, and ask you for some specific on the 6 key findings. So you can look at your notes there on the 6 key findings, and if there's anything you want to say specific on any of those, you don't have to cover all of them. So Sarah, we'll throw it to you. How does this report resonate with your own successful rural research in Western Canada, especially?
Right. So the fun part about going after Bill is I can just say that I agree with Bill, and it makes it really easy for me. And similar to Bill, I want to thank the authors of the report for putting this together. I started really focusing on rural development in about 2010, 2011. And if I had had this report then, I would have spent considerably less time frustrated and confused and going to Sean and Bill saying, what the hell is rural policy? And how do I find out whether it's evolving or what it's doing? So, you know, in hindsight, that would have been great. So I guess I'm going to start with some broad comments and then move to a few specific ones. Something that I noticed in this report that kind of resonates with the work that I've been doing is, since I started in about 2010, 2011, It was challenging to find current to that point mentions of rural in policy, and that has been increasing since I've been paying attention, I guess. So I, like looking at that time frame, rural has been increasingly acknowledged and discussed in an explicit way, and we're seeing that. I knew is not the right word, but the reemergence of the federal ministry and the rural lens, and all of those types of things starting to gain a little bit more traction, which I saw reflected in the report, and I find that to be very hopeful. But there was a quote in the section around the federal rural policies that stood out to me as kind of reflecting my overarching experience, which is that the current approaches to rural economic development are piecemeal and they're fragmented. And that, like, I was like, yes, that, everything about that. And it's especially true when we talk about rural investments and funding programs, because they are so very piecemeal and they are fragmented. They're project specific. They don't fund the things that the communities actually need. And they don't account for the continued downloading of responsibilities and increased number of responsibilities that communities have. There's also this challenge around even just rural economic development, and I saw in the graphs that was the kind of the dominant topic for a lot of these strategies and plans. But what does that actually mean? And I mean, we could go around the table and ask people to define that. This is relatively small sample size. We get a lot of different answers. You start going to different governments, and it's everything from traditional economics from somewhere in the 18th century to a more integrated, holistic perspective on development. And so that makes things quite challenging. So I guess overall, I'm so optimistic and pleased to see rural coming more onto the agenda, but I'm retaining some cynicism as to whether this will actually have a meaningful impact. Or is it that kind of, I don't know, fad or blip, the way we saw sustainability being huge for a number of years and everybody had to have sustainability plans and those types of things, and hopefully not. Anyway, so those are kind of my broad thoughts. And then I did want to speak specifically to some of the key findings, and then we can turn it back to Bill. So as Patrick mentioned, I primarily work in BC these days. I came to this position from the provincial government, so I say I have a reasonable awareness of things that go over on at the province. And so when I thought of the key findings related to sector-specific approaches, natural resources, and rural tourism, the first point that I thought of that I wanted to note was the challenge around rural policies and how that rural piece is identified and discussed. And this is not a critique of the report in any way. It's more to acknowledge the complexity. So take something like the existing use groundwater policy, which is a riveting topic that everybody should care about. Nowhere in that policy will you see anything about rural or economic development, but that policy, the entire thing, is essentially rural development because it exists to implement legislation around an issue that is exclusively rural, and it relates entirely to rural businesses and industries. And so the number of that's one example basically of the number of policies that exist out there that are almost de facto rural. And they don't get brought into things like this because their ruralness is never really talked about. And we also don't know the effort that went into rural proofing those things. They're also disconnected from these larger rural development strategies. And that brings me to the second point that I wanted to kind of raise on this topic, which is that disconnect around strategic policies and programs and operational policies and programs. Those strategic policies, a lot of what shows up in this report, they're bigger, they're aspirational. Governments love to put them out, usually around a ministry change. They focus on these missions and visions and high priorities, but they're often incredibly disconnected from the operational policy. And it's really hard for us to see and understand the operational policy because a lot of that's not public. It's entirely internal. And so when we think of things like natural resources and the potential for rural economic development around natural resources, you've got these somewhat disconnected higher level strategic documents that miss some of the rural opportunities or miss being explicit about the rural opportunities, but they also almost have to, because at an operational side, the legislation doesn't allow for some of those rural opportunities. And so you get this, it's half disconnect, half conflict between the different levels of policy from strategic to operational. And it's really problematic because they need to work together. I've never met anybody in or out of government that has disputed the need for better integration, for innovation, for collaboration and co-creation. But the governance and jurisdictional structure makes this almost impossible to do in a meaningful way because somebody somewhere is holding the balance of power, and it's often underpinned by legislation that is very hard to change. And so I would say to that first question, maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah, I think so in a lot of the bills that suggestions, pardon me, that Bill had mentioned, they only work if we can change that underpinning structure, if we can give away some of the power, if we can change some of the legislation, like that's a big hold there. So I'll leave it there, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think we are moving along with the time now. I think between you and Bill, you've covered some broad areas there. I'm just going to open up for some questions from the audience first, and then we might loop back to Bill and Sarah for a closing comment if we have time. So I'm going to maybe in the first instance, before I see there are some questions that have been sort of discussed in the chat, and I'm going to try to catch up on those. But
oh, Patrick, you went on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I hope you caught most of what I was saying there. I think I just somehow went on mute. Okay, but I just dropped into the chat very quickly. Next week we have a conference that CRRF is co-hosting along with CEDEC in Quebec, and there is a free online program as part of that conference. So if you haven't seen that, you can click the link and sign up for that. It may help address some of those questions around rurality and rural issues that were asked in the chat specific to Quebec. So I think at this stage, is there anybody who would like to turn on their microphone and ask a question directly to the report authors? And please feel free to turn on your microphone and just start speaking, because otherwise we had a couple of questions in the chat. So do feel free to turn on your microphone if you do want to ask a question. But there was a couple of questions. There was one on COVID-19 and rural migration, and I see that Sean sort of addressed that, but let's maybe have a quick look at that question, because this report, as you said, was a snapshot, capture in time, and of course COVID-19 was like a different type of snapshot, like which exposed a lot of issues in rural and urban areas. But maybe I'll have a quick look at that question, and maybe in the context of the report, how you link it to COVID-19, and of course, as was pointed out in the chat, the CRRF had a series of insight papers and a special issue in the Journal of Rural and Community Development specifically on COVID-19 and rural issues. But the question, what lessons, if any, can we learn from the pandemic? And so from any of the report authors, Tamara, or any of your team, if anyone would like to say anything on COVID-19 and your report, what can we learn?
Well, one thing I can remark on is that with COVID-19, it essentially kind of amplified entrenched inequalities, because some places had internet, some places could deliver with quality schools and so on, and other places didn't have that, and those places are at risk of falling further behind. So a big feature of much of my research is understanding territorial inequality, competitiveness, and cohesion, and the policies that support that or don't. And I think that COVID-19, not too many of the strategies that we looked at, remind me, Brooke, but I don't think so, explicitly addressed COVID because that was kind of all happening very, very quickly. Yeah,
it was emerging right at the time that we started doing the review. And for the purposes of this report, we only identified if it was an existing program that got some addition to it, with respect to COVID, rather than a sort of temporary program that was around alleviating pressures associated with COVID. So if it was a temporary COVID-related specific thing, it was not included in the report. But if it built on an existing program that had some type of rural impact or sort of relevance, then we did include it. So it was really, if it was temporary, short-term, specific to COVID, not included in the report. But yeah, it did. There was a shift towards sort of maybe more economic development strategies showing up. We did see some kind of more cohesive economic development strategies appearing around that time, some of which referred to rural. I would add that, but I think that's add there.
Great.
And that's it.
I see we have Abdullah with his hand up. Karen, did you want to chime in on that, or?
I was just going to say, like, from here where I sit in Nova Scotia, we had there was a lot of talk about what COVID did to migration specifically, and what it did to the housing market in rural and urban Nova Scotia. But even the discourse around it, like in the public, has been really focused on Halifax, and people who've even said, like, I know it's not an issue outside of Halifax, when we in fact do have rural communities that are just really struggling. People can't find housing, or they can't afford it, and some of that is driven by the pandemic driven migration, and so it's been, you know, here it's sort of depressing. I don't see rural actually getting much attention.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do have a question from Abdullah, which we'll take in just a moment. But just while we're on that issue, as the tourism guy, I just wanted to point out one interesting thing for me. Tourism was not on the agenda. I think during COVID-19, it really exposed how important a role tourism does play in rural economic development, especially out here in Western Canada, in BC, for example, where I work. And so I think coming out of it, your 6 key findings from sort of before lined up with what policy changes will come after COVID-19 could be very interesting to sort of compare. And are we going to see meaningful changes in the year or two ahead, which I think we would. Okay, we'll take a question from Abdullah. If you're ready there, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is Abdullah Bamasoud. I'm calling from Ontario. I just wanted to follow up, because that was my question around the changes in the population and the migration from urban areas. We've seen, you know, like a loss of families, individuals moving from urban centers, Greater Toronto area, for example, to more rural areas that were more affordable, but that had the, you know, impact of putting pressure on housing, on infrastructure, etc. So I was just curious if there were any thing that you came across that kind of looked into that. I think Karen kind of touched on that in her answer. And thank you again for the report. It was very timely. Thanks.
Thanks, Abdullah. I think from the snapshot, and Brooke, feel free to chime in, from the snapshot we took, one thing that comes across is that strategies take long to do. And so there's a lack of responsiveness there. And so a short answer to your question is, yeah, there were some strategies, but there were policies coming out that were quick to address this, but there wasn't a kind of cohesive strategy to understand and address it from government. And that's just because these strategies take a very, very long time, especially as we have expectations around deliberation and engagement. Another issue, and I always laugh doing research like this, it's that I always make the joke that, you know, there's no year on these documents sometimes because public servants think they're so timeless. It is frustrating. We have to have an understanding of the year in these strategic documents, and how long is this strategy relevant for. And one of the things we often question is, when a new government comes in, what's really happening with the previous strategic documents? Are they still the raison d'etre of how the bureaucracy is organizing itself? And that isn't necessarily clear. And so that's kind of not a good answer to your question, but it's realistically how we saw this in the documentation. Sean, yeah.
Yeah, no, those are great points, Tamara, and an excellent question, Abdullah. I think part of the challenge here is that we don't know how durable some of those population changes and immigration shifts will be over time. There's already sort of signals that the return to the office, things like that, are starting to shift the dynamics once again. That puts us in a challenging position. As Tamara mentioned, the policy responses often takes quite a long time. Some of the immediate economic development money that was shoveled out the door can happen a little bit more quickly. But in terms of responding to housing affordability, housing numbers, the durability of the changes that we've witnessed during the pandemic make it a challenging policy response because we're not entirely sure where we're going to be in a year or two from now. So are we, through a policy action, actually addressing the right problem? Or how situational has that been linked to the COVID crisis? So that's a particular challenge. And, as has already been mentioned, Diane Looker's article in the Journal of Rural Community Development articulates that some of the per caseload numbers were lower in rural places, but the suite of articles from that journal and also from the CRRF reports point out that it really revealed some of the structural challenges that rural places face, whether it's housing affordability, broadband, access to healthcare, incredible equity issues associated with First Nations health outcomes and things like that. So I think we'll be sifting through some of the findings of those impacts for quite a while now, or to come.
Thank you, Sean. I'm just going to go back a final, as we're coming to the end of our time together, a final chance for Bill or Sarah, if you have any final comments on the report, and then we'll conclude this session.
So one of the questions, I'm just going to sneak in ahead of Bill. One of the questions that Patrick and Tamara posed to us when we were prepping for this was what makes for good rural policy, and thinking about this report. And it feels slightly against the grain to say this, but there are days when I wish that we didn't actually need to have rural specific policy and strategy, because if we could just have good policy generally, where all of our policies included place, both rural and urban and different types of rural, like if all policies were able to be responsive to the needs of different types of places, if all policies were able to have that aspect of integration between sectors and between levels of government, and if all policies were flexible enough to adapt when someone somewhere demonstrates how they got it wrong, like that's why it's a policy cycle, not a policy line. So if we had all of our policies having those three things consistently, so that we wouldn't have to have, a often very well thought out, well-intentioned aspirational rural development policy that doesn't ever actually get integrated into the meaningful policy. So it just becomes frustrating. So I guess that would be, in terms of what makes for good rural policy, that would be what I would hope for.
Thank you, Sarah. And Bill, any final thoughts?
I love it, Sarah, that you've come full circle. You seem to be quite pessimistic about this changes, and now that's where you want the work to be done. I think this is great, because this is very exciting to me that both the discussion and the data and the information is on the table. I don't have additional questions other than to express my own optimism in both the work that you're doing, the kind of work that's being done, and its contributions to helping us understand and perhaps then do something, whether it is at the general level, as you mentioned, or the operational level. Thanks very much for inviting me along.
Thank you, Bill. And before I wrap it up, I'll just say, Tamara or your team, any final words from you?
Thanks, everyone. Just really appreciate the conversation. And I have to say, I know what I want to say. I want to say I came back to Canada and I reached out to the rural group of rural researchers across Canada, and I just have not seen a nicer bunch of people. You have such a great community. And the very final thing I wanted to say about this report that we didn't touch on is how we are actually seeing Indigenous economic development addressed in some places, obviously, particularly in the territories, but that's an important shift to pay attention to. And that is a key rural, issue in Canada. So yeah, more to come on that, I think, more research to be done on that. Anyone else want to chime in? Yeah, and thank you to CRRF and Shirk and the team, yeah, and Brooke especially.
Thanks, Tamara, and thank everyone for joining us today. Please make sure that you look out for this video on our social media. I think we're going to post it afterwards, so you can share it with all your friends who couldn't make it today. Just by way of conclusion, on behalf of CRRF, thanks again, Tamara and your team, for bringing this report to us. It's a real asset for CRRF to have people like you working on these issues. And just a final comment on the report. I think we've come to the end of our time together, but I really see it as a beginning. Like today, we're relaunching our seminar series, and we're really grateful for you for giving us the opportunity to do that. But I also see the report and these 6 key findings as a sort of a beginning, a sort of a lens, a snapshot lens as we come out of COVID-19. And well, what did the situation look like? What was the state of the art in rural Canada in 2022? And where are the places that we can make those positive changes that Bill and Sarah have pointed to? So thanks everyone, and I think we'll leave it there for today. Thank you.